This is Changing Denver, the show about our city, how we make it, and how it makes us. I'm Paul Caroli. These past few weeks have not been a particularly comfortable time for me. The reaction to our episode about the safety of the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge was overwhelming. The complaints and the insults have definitely been the worst part, but even the kind words from people who agree with my conclusion were not exactly fun to read. And it's hard to explain why. Even though I'm still confident about my conclusions, I'm not used to being in the middle of this kind of partisanship. And a small part of me worries that I approached this whole story the wrong way. Anyway, that brings us to today. I haven't changed my mind, but I do want some relief. This episode is my attempt to satisfy that small part of me that's been shouting from behind the curtain about fairness and impartiality. What you are about to hear are two interviews about an angle of the Rocky Flats story that we have yet to explore. See, ever since the public really became aware of what was happening at Rocky Flats in the late 1960s, there have been studies of the health effects in the surrounding communities. During the production years, these studies bolstered claims about dangerous mismanagement at the plant, and they play a similar role today. The activists point to the fact that the refuge lands were not remediated during the cleanup, and allege that the lingering contaminants have caused a cancer cluster. I looked into the history of these studies and found them inconclusive. That's why I chose to focus our episode about the science on health physics, and that's why you heard from Dr. Thomas Johnson of Colorado State University.
You want the simple, easy answer? I can give it to you right away.
Well, maybe not the simple, easy answer, but like a good answer.
My answer is, I would be happy to bring my children there and have them play and ride their bicycles.
That's where I'm coming from, so let's get to it. The first thing you're about to hear is my recent conversation with a man named Randy Stafford. He came to the Rocky Flats issue around the same time I did, but he focused instead on these health impact studies I mentioned. Over the course of my reporting, we'd met a few times. I'd describe Randy as a friendly acquaintance. After we released our episode about the whole science issue, he reached out and requested a chance to respond. This is that response. One last note. Randy is not an epidemiologist. He's an independent researcher like me. I just ask that you keep that in mind as you listen. Do you prefer Randy or Randall?
Randy.
Randy, cool. Yeah. Okay. So Randy, tell me your Rocky Flats story.
My Rocky Flats story, I have several connections to Rocky Flats. Probably the main one is that my aunt worked there for 15 years in Building 371. My mother's sister, she was there from 1986 to 2001. And also my uncle, my mother's brother, is a civil engineer, and he worked on some of the buildings there. And my mother's entire family, they all grew up in Arvada. So the 1957 fire happened on her 17th birthday. She was a junior at Arvada High School.
Wow.
So those are my connections to Rocky Flats. But my story really just began with reading Full Body Burden. A friend loaned it to me when it first came out, and this friend was also familiar with the ambush grand jury. And I just got really interested in the story. And so I read...
What about it grabbed you? Do you think it was like the personal story?
Well, to be honest, what I really liked about Full Body Burden was how Kristen Iverson captured the sense of kind of carefree innocence of growing up on the very western fringe of the Denver suburbs in that era, the late 70s and the 1980s. I related to that very well because it was similar to my experience growing up in Littleton, basically. But also just the mystery and the sort of the horror of the contamination and the consequences of the contamination. That's what I really latched onto, was contamination and consequences.
Mm-hmm. So what did you do from there?
From there, I read The Ambush Grand Jury, and I read Len Ackland's book, Making a Real Killing. And then I began, a friend invited me to the Fish and Wildlife sharing sessions in the summer of 2017. So I began going to the sharing sessions. And I also have an uncle who was the manager of the Alaska Maritime Wildlife Refuge, which included the island of Amchitka in the Aleutians, where Atomic Energy Commission did underground nuclear weapons testing in the late 60s and 1970s. And I knew from my aunt and uncle that Fish and Wildlife had employees on Amchitka and their families, and those employees and their family members developed cancers. So I had very reliable information that there was a precedent for what's happening at Rocky Flats in terms of opening a wildlife refuge on a former nuclear site. And I also asked my uncle his opinion on Fish and Wildlife doing that, and he's not a fan. He wrote me a fairly scathing opinion saying that he thinks the land should be kept by the agency that screwed it up, and they should be responsible for fencing it and patrolling it and putting signs on it. So I began to go to the sharing sessions, and then to satisfy my own curiosity, I went to the next level of research. I looked at all the footnotes and all the endnotes in Full Body Burden and Ambush Grand Jury, and I began going to the CU Norland Library Special Collections and Archives Unit and finding the original studies, the original documents and records and files from people like Carl Johnson and Jack Cobb and others. And
who is Carl Johnson specifically? Because that's something I haven't touched on in this series yet.
Well, Carl Johnson was the director of Jefferson County Public Health Department in most of the 70s and early 80s, and he was the first scientist to conduct an epidemiological study on the downwind population compared to farther away for cancer. And he also conducted soil studies. So he was ousted in a political maneuver by Jefferson County commissioners and Board of Health after publishing his findings. There was an election cycle, and some new county commissioners got elected, and they appointed new members of the Board of Health who had business interests around Rocky Flats.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. May or may not have owned the land that would be developed if it was safer than it may have seemed or something.
Yeah, one of them had a factory that was a contractor to, I think it was some business that was a contractor to Dow. Anyway, the new majority on the Board of Health asked Carl Johnson to resign, and said if he didn't, they'd fire him. And he eventually sued Jefferson County and won. There was a settlement, and he accepted a settlement ultimately, which was determined to be a victory for him for wrongful termination. But it was a political ouster because his publications were affecting business prospects in the area of Rocky Flats. Mm-hmm. So that's who Carl Johnson was.
And Carl Johnson, you said he's the first person to do one of these studies, and I think that's of particular interest to you. That's been the way you've concentrated your research, right?
Correct. So my research has been specifically focused on two things. I have surveyed all of the known studies of off-site soil contamination, and by off-site I basically mean in the Indiana corridor or east of Indiana. And I have surveyed all of the existing studies of public health impact, of which there are precious few, I like to say. In the entire history of Rocky Flats, there have only been 5 epidemiological studies of the downwind population, and Carl Johnson's was the first.
Only 5. That's remarkably few to me for such a high-profile issue. Correct.
There are 2 other studies that have been done that are worth mentioning, but they're not proper epidemiological studies, so we could say 7 total, but really 5.
Mm-hmm. Now, I looked into this a little bit. I admit I don't think I went to the same level of detail that you did, but to my eye, these studies were contradictory between each other, and overall, I took them as just inconclusive, and I pursued a different path for assessing the health risks. Now, tell me about, I think you probably have thoughts about each one. So maybe just tell me about the history here.
Sure, I'll go through them chronologically. So Carl Johnson's study was in the, I want to say, late 70s. It was after Cray and Hardy. So he took the Cray and Hardy map and he designated what he called areas 1 through 4, kind of according to the isopleths in the Cray-Hardy map, with area 4 being farthest away from the plant with the least contamination, and area 1 being closest to the plant with the most contamination. And he compared cancer. He compared incidence of certain kinds of cancers by area, and he found that people who lived in area 1 closest to the plant had, for example, 24% more incidence of, I believe it was lung cancer, than people farthest away in less contaminated areas. And he also noticed a pronounced incidence of cancer of the gonads, especially cancer of the testicles in males. And he was using data from 1969 to 1971 from the Colorado Cancer Registry, or its predecessor. So that was the first one, and he published his work in a peer-reviewed medical journal called AMBIO, which is from the Swedish Royal Academy of Medicine. And then after Carl Johnson, there was a guy named Stephen Chin, who was a physicist, and he was employed by, I believe it was Fairfield and Woods was the law firm, and an attorney named Howard Holmes, who were counsel for the plaintiffs in Church versus United States. So maybe you've heard this part of the history. Actually, because Dr. Johnson, the way this all started was the Jefferson County Commissioners asked Dr. Carl Johnson to weigh in on a rezoning request for residential development around Rocky Flats. And Dr. Johnson recommended against the rezoning because he didn't think the area was safe for residential development. That caused the Church family to sue the United States government for contaminating their land, and that's generally known as the Church lawsuit, or Church versus United States. Well, Stephen Chin did a study that basically became an exhibit in Church versus United States, where he used multiple regression analysis to identify which factors accounted for the increased cancer incidence the most. And he used the same data as Carl Johnson, 69 to 71. And what Chin found was that the most important factor of all was the direction the person lived from Rocky Flats. So relative to the prevailing wind direction, if you were downwind of the 903 area, you were most likely to get cancer. And the second most important factor Chin found was the distance from Rocky Flats. So that was an important study. It was never published. It was an exhibit in a lawsuit, and I had to go down to I think it was the Federal Records Center or the District Court Clerk's office to find the study. Then some time went by, and actually, I'm overlooking one. There was a study by a guy named Kenneth Crump, and it was DOE funded, and it was after Chin. So Crump, in the first couple sections of his study, he exactly replicated Carl Johnson's results. And then he did an additional step or two where he tried to adjust for urbanization, he called it, because I think the idea is that the more urbanized an area, the more confounding there is, the more smoking there is, for example, which might confound the outcome. But the way Crump applied urbanization was by the direction the cancer victim lived, the distance the cancer victim lived from the capital of Colorado in Denver, from the Capitol building. And Crump was later criticized by a very qualified epidemiologist named Richard Clapp for doing that. Richard Clapp called that highly unorthodox. He'd never seen that kind of urbanization adjustment, and he'd never seen it done by distance from an arbitrarily chosen building. So Crump's study was DOE funded, and it had this methodological question. Then, after Crump, there was a guy named Well, there was Richard Clapp, and Richard Clapp was director of the Massachusetts Cancer Registry for a while. He's a PhD epidemiologist from Harvard, I believe, and he was a witness for the plaintiffs in Cook versus Rockwell. And he did a new epidemiology.
Which is Cook versus Rockwell.
Sure. Cook versus Rockwell was a class action suit by a group of property owners around Rocky Flats against Rockwell International Corporation, and there may have been one or two other named defendants, complaining of contamination of those people's land, or basically containing of trespass on those people's land by contaminants from Rocky Flats, and I think nuisance of the trespass, nuisance of the contaminants. And as we all know, Cook versus Rockwell was 20 years in the courts and was settled for, was found for the plaintiff class, was decided for the plaintiff class with an award total of $375 million being paid out currently.
Yeah, and this was just a few years ago, and I think those checks were distributed very recently.
Correct. The final decision on the payout was made, was it just last summer? Maybe 2 summers ago. Mm-hmm. Very recent event.
Okay, so there was someone who gave evidence in that case.
Correct. Dr. Richard Clapp, an epidemiologist, did a new study using newer data, so not the 69 to 71 data, but he used data up through 1994, I think. And he found 29% greater cancer incidence in populations closer to Rocky Flats than farther away. And again, his study wasn't published. It was an exhibit in a lawsuit. I had to go down to district court clerk's office to get his study, but very important because it's newer data up to about, I want to say 94, and a very qualified scientist doing the work. So that's 4 out of 5, Johnson, Chin, Crump, Clapp, and then there's the CDPHE studies. Okay, so the CDPHE did cancer incidence studies. The first one was published, let me consult a resource here, 1998, and then they did an update in 2016 and 2017. And these studies found no alarming difference between cancer incidence in the population in neighborhoods, around Rocky Flats versus general Denver metro area. But these CDPHE cancer studies have some significant methodological flaws, the most important of which is that they included in neighborhoods around Rocky Flats a bunch of areas that were not contaminated. They included a bunch of areas north of Highway 128, including up in Boulder, which are not downwind of Rocky Flats and therefore didn't have any contamination. And they not only was it north of Highway 128, but it was also really far east, like all the way up to, for example, Thornton, east of I-25 and North Glen. And they considered those neighborhoods to be nearby Rocky Flats. So it's almost like they were comparing the same thing to the same thing. If they did it by regional statistical area or zip code, which is a very large-grained piece of geography, whereas Carl Johnson originally did it by census tract, which is a fine-grained piece of geography. So you can take a population in a small census tract and compare it to a population in another small census tract and really get a contrast. But if you take a population in a big zip code and compare it to a population in another big zip code, you may not get that much contrast. So the CDPHE study had a variety of methodological flaws. The first one didn't include rare cancers, but the update in 2016 and 17 did include, for example, thyroid cancer, ovarian cancer, and of all these 5 studies, including CDPHE, they are only focused on cancer, and there are other types of health effects that can be caused by radionuclide contamination, for example, neurological disease, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, things like that. And there have never been any studies of the incidence of those kinds of things in the downwind population. So just for completeness, the other two studies that I mentioned that are not proper epidemiological studies, there was a man named John Cobb, is nicknamed Jock. He was a department head at CU School of Medicine and a professor of preventative medicine. He was the principal investigator on a long-running EPA study that looked at plutonium concentration in people's livers and lung tissue that was collected at autopsy with permission. So he compared liver and lung tissue from Rocky Flats downwinders to liver and lung tissue from people in Pueblo who were not exposed. A total of, I think, 519 people, probably about half and half. And he found that the people downwind of Rocky Flats didn't have that much more plutonium in their livers and lungs than the control population, but importantly, they had Rocky Flats specific plutonium in their liver and lung tissues by isotope ratio. So the Puebloans had global fallout isotope ratios, and the downwinders had weapons grade isotope ratios. So it was a signature that indicated their plutonium definitely came from Rocky Flats. So to me, that raises the question, well, how the heck did this Rocky Flats plutonium get into these people's livers and lungs that lived there? It was found there. How did it get in there? So that wasn't an epidemiological study, but a very interesting one. And then finally, there's the Metropolitan State University Health Survey, which is not a proper epidemiological study. It's a convenient study, a self-selecting population that are responding to a survey as opposed to a designed cohort study. But it's important because it demonstrates the need for another epidemiological study. And the findings of the MSU study are that out of roughly 1,700 survey responses, almost exactly half of those reported rare cancers, and the national rate of rare cancers is lower, and then also
lower than what?
Lower than what was found in the MSU study. So I'll give you precise numbers here. 1,745 completed surveys, 848 cases of cancer. 414 of those 848, which is 49%, were rare, which means a rare cancer is one where there are fewer than 15 cases per 100,000 people, whereas the United States rate for rare cancers is 25%. So we have twice the rate of rare cancers locally than you would expect nationally. And then furthermore, if you rank the prevalence of different cancers, nationally, thyroid cancer ranks 9th in prevalence, but in the MSU survey responses, thyroid cancer ranked 2nd in prevalence. And the thyroid is a radiosensitive organ. So the prevalence of thyroid cancer locally is much higher than you would expect nationally. So those were two interesting findings of the MSU Health Survey. And then the other outcome that was really interesting was the geoplots. I don't know if you've seen these, but they produced, they geoplotted the address of the survey respondents reporting cancer on a map. And then they overlaid the reconstructed smoke plume from the 1957 fire, and they overlaid the Cray-Hardy map, and the correlation is striking. The survey boundary area was very big. It was Highway 93 to I-25, and it was Colfax to Arapahoe Road in Boulder. But the clustering of cancers within that gigantic boundary is concentrated in Arvada, south of Stanley Lake, and correlates strikingly with the 57 fire plume and the Cray-Hardy map. Mm-hmm. So that was an interesting outcome also from the MSU study.
Okay, so we got 6 studies in a survey.
Yes.
What are the implications of this collection of data in your mind?
In my mind, the question is why. If you believe Carl Johnson's findings, if you believe Richard Clapp's findings, why did people closer to Rocky Flats have more cancers than people farther away? And I know that Mark Johnson has gone public recently with
the current director of Jefferson County Public Health.
Yes, thank you. And I asked Mark Johnson once when I met with him, what can a study tell you? And he said, at best, a study can tell you strong association between the presence of a contaminant in the environment and an increased disease incidence in the same environment. So strong association. And there's always this causality question, right? Like, did Rocky Flats contamination cause this higher disease incidence that was found by some very qualified scientists? And that's a tough question to answer. But I think as a layman that there is a way it could be answered, or at least narrowed down, which is to analyze tumor tissue for Rocky Flats plutonium.
Yeah, I asked, Harvey Nichols brought this up too, actually.
Yeah.
He said this at the MSU, the preliminary survey results meeting. He went during the Q&A section. He said this. He was like, if someone would donate a tumor to science, I could do the analysis and I could demonstrate that it came from Rocky Flats. I could do the isotope ratio testing or whatever. I don't remember his exact words or how he would do it.
Right.
But I asked him about this directly, and he said he didn't have the money or he didn't have the technology or something. And it just seems like why hasn't that been done? How about that? That's a question for you.
Probably money.
How much money would it cost?
Well, $200. So
come on.
Yeah. So
then I don't believe it, because the hosting costs for the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center website has cost $200 in the last year.
So I emailed the director of the U.S. Transuranic Registry. Do you know what the Transuranic Registry is?
No.
The U.S. Transuranic Registry is the organization that does all of the studies of nuclear workers' tissues. It's affiliated with the University of Washington, and I emailed its executive director the other month. Forget his name. It's a Russian name. And I asked him if he could recommend to me a couple of laboratories that might test either cremation ashes or tissue samples from members of the general public, i.e., not nuclear workers. So he emailed me back, and he recommended two companies to me. One of them is a company named Test America, and I'd have to look up the other one. So
that's okay. I mean, that doesn't really matter that much, the name of the companies.
So I contacted both those companies, and I requested quotes for the service of analyzing either a sample of cremation ash or a sample of tissue for radionuclides. And I got back a quote from Test America of $200. They'll take the sample and put it on their mass spectrometer or their alpha spectrometer and do the isotope ratio analysis and everything. And I have a friend whose mother died. This is the same friend that gave me full body burden back in 2012. Her mother died of myeloplastic syndrome, which is a bone marrow cancer. Her mother lived in same address in Wheat Ridge, actually the same street that Carl Johnson used to live on for 50 years. She loved to garden, and she's going to have a sample of her ashes, cremation ashes, tested for plutonium, Rocky Flats plutonium content. And by the way, there's a precedent for this. Lloyd Mixon, who's a figure in Rocky Flats history, he was the farmer with the deformed pig and named Scooter. He had his tumor tissue tested for Rocky Flats plutonium with positive results. He mentions that in an interview he gave in the movie Dark Circle. And the other one is Rex Hogg, whose daughter Kristen Hogg died of bone cancer as a teenager. She's described in Full Body Burden. While Rex Hogg had Kristen Hogg's ashes analyzed for Rocky Flats plutonium with positive findings, and that's discussed in Full Body Burden. So there is precedent for this. With cremation ash, you don't know where in the body the plutonium was. Mm-hmm. But if you have somebody with a primary tumor, let's say a brain tumor or a breast tumor, and and that primary tumor is excised and analyzed for Rocky Flats plutonium, I would think, to my mind, Paul, if Rocky Flats specific plutonium by isotope ratio is found in that primary tumor tissue sample, that's a pretty strong indication that it caused the cancer. Now, of course, this stuff costs money. People have to want to do it. They have to know what lab can do it. They have to, execute. They have to preserve the sample and send it off. But I think the question is answerable, the causality question. And with Tom Johnson's...
or at least in your mind, we're able to get much closer.
Yes. And as a health physicist, Tom Johnson might have an opinion on that. I would actually be interested in his opinion on that. Besides Test America, the other company I contacted wanted a certified health physicist to be involved in the transaction. Test America didn't require that. So
I sent him an email.
Yeah.
He's out there.
Tom Johnson?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was also very intrigued by his comments about you have to analyze the assumptions that are being made in the models, which is totally accurate. And this is off topic of the health studies, but this is one of the, actually it is related. I feel strongly that measurement of health impact is much more important than modeling of dosage and excess risk.
Oh, clearly. I mean, all of this research you've done has been about measuring whether or not there's a cancer cluster, so-called.
Exactly. So Tom Johnson quoted to you that all models are wrong and some models are useful. I have another author, a guy named Eberhard Rechten, who writes about architecting complex systems, which is my professional field, and he has a heuristic in one of his books. Title of the book is Systems Architecting, but the heuristic is a model is not reality. So reality is what's happening on the ground around there. For example, in 5 parks, I think you and I have mentioned this, that there have been 2 cases of an extremely rare cardiac angiosarcoma, heart cancer, in 5 parks, which is a 15-year-old neighborhood at 86th and Indiana. And in addition to those 2 cases of heart cancer, Elaine McNeely, whose husband died of cardiac angiosarcoma, he's one of the cases, she stated at a Rocky Flats Stewardship Council meeting that 2 of our neighbors were diagnosed with Parkinson's while living there. 1 was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. There was a case of liver cancer. There was a case of brain cancer. And that's all on one street in 5 parks. To me, this cannot be coincidence. We're talking about a neighborhood that's 2 miles directly downwind of the 903 area. It's only 15 years old.
Yeah.
And the people, there have been at least a half dozen cases of rare cancer and neurological disease in that neighborhood.
I totally get where you're coming from. That's why I wanted to have you on, because I think these studies do provide a lot of interesting data. It's a legitimate alternative perspective, in my opinion. If the scientific consensus on, you'd say, the modeling side of this evaluation are wrong, then this would be a way to show it.
Yes.
So I say, I think it's great. I'm happy to share it. Although I do think that, I've heard these stories about the 2 rare heart cancers before. And I think the response here is like, that's just how probabilities work. Things are rare, but that doesn't mean they don't happen. And I know that that's unsatisfying, but that's just how it is. I mean, that's what numbers do.
Yeah, cancer clusters, I think, are mysterious. Astronomically low odds of 2 people in the same neighborhood in the same couple of years getting the same extremely rare heart cancer. Is it, statistically impossible? No. Is it likely? No. Why did it happen? I think it's too late with Brian McNeely, unfortunately, to analyze his heart tumor for Rocky Flats plutonium, but for the other case, if the family is willing, it may not be too late.
A few months before I spoke with Randy, I was already planning an episode about the cancer studies he knows so well. Remember Chapter 3 of Unclear Danger? I first heard about this whole issue through a friend that was helping out with the Metro State survey Randy mentioned. And ever since the preliminary results of that survey were released in late 2016, I've been keeping tabs on the project. The person leading the charge now is Stephanie Malin.
My name is Dr. Stephanie Malin. I am an assistant professor of sociology at Colorado State University. I'm also an adjunct assistant professor with the Colorado School of Public Health, and I study the community, environmental justice, and environmental health impacts of energy production and energy development, but more broadly, extractive industries as well.
While I was in Fort Collins to speak with Dr. Thomas Johnson, I also sat down with Stephanie in her office in the sociology department. I wanted to get a sense of where the project stood, understand how these studies work, and to ask a few hard questions about why they're necessary. She's deep into this stuff now, but Stephanie's Rocky Flats story started a long time ago, back when she was doing her postdoc at Brown University. Like Randy and many others, Stephanie first felt the real weight of Rocky Flats when she read Kristen Iverson's book, Full Body Burden.
Her work was just so spectacular because it's such a unique mix of memoir and history and the environmental justice and health impacts of the facility. So I'd known about it, which once I moved here in August 2013, I realized was kind of an anomaly. A lot of people lived here and had never heard of it. There was kind of this veil over it once you started asking questions about it. But how I became actively involved, a couple years ago, I was contacted by a few different community groups in Arvada and around the former site who were concerned about some health impacts that they were observing in their daily lives. And so it was really these community groups and advocates contacting me and asserting that they wanted a community-driven health study done. That pulled me into doing research on the issue. And there were several women primarily that were involved in different aspects of the study that had been contacted by different folks, especially the Rocky Flats downwinders. And instead of those activists and community organizers putting their energy in all these different directions, I had suggested we try to kind of have a loose coalition of researchers, right? So we're looking at different strands of these health problems that people are noticing collectively and kind of pooling our knowledge and our expertise. And so that really jumped. I hopped onto Carol Jensen's project out of Metro State at the time, and it's very unfunded and slow going, but we're doing what we can. Certainly driven by the community requesting that these sorts of questions be asked and the data be collected about their health experiences and their diagnoses rather than using state databases and the cancer registry and things like that they feel aren't capturing their experiences.
Right. Okay, so let's back up. A couple of follow-ups.
Yeah.
Back when Kristen Iverson's book came out and you said that it was a topic of conversation among your research group, how did those conversations play out? Very
good. So in our research group, it was all about contested illnesses. And what that means is in the context of communities like Arvada or other communities that have produced uranium, for example, there are often health impacts that community members will observe, things like cancer clusters or birth defect clusters. It depends on the phase of the fuel cycle and the latency period that's passed. But there are a lot of what you call legacy sites around the state of Colorado and other states. And many other places, right, related to other chemicals and other kinds of extraction and production and things like that. So in this group, we would talk about the research that we were doing and that others were doing, looking at the biomedical model. It's a certain paradigm that we use a lot in Western medicine and Western science that looks at very individual level causes for diseases. So things like lifestyle and diet and genetics, especially genetics now, right? And of course, those are very important components of health, but it's one set of components, right? As a sociologist, I understand, and so do other sociologists, that health, and epidemiologists too, right? They also look at social determinants of health and other aspects that are more collective and structural, but we're an individual embedded in a community and embedded in a society. And of course, our ability to access healthcare and our health experiences are very much related to those social aspects of our lives, the communities we live in, the access to healthcare we have, our ability to have employment with healthcare attached to it. In the U.S., all these unique problems, but then also more biophysically, the environment, right, also impacts our health. So we are part of the environment, and if we are exposed to things in the environment that can that are contaminants and that can interact with our bodies and especially our endocrine systems, we'll often see health impacts emerge in places that have been production or extraction centers for things like plutonium or uranium. And people there will observe health problems, and they'll often even do what we call popular epidemiology, where they map out households that might have these problems and can often relate them to the sources of contamination. It's fascinating. Love Canal was kind of the first big case where that happened. But the upshot is, oftentimes, even with all that work, the federal agencies or the state agencies or corporations that are responsible for these sites being contaminated or for remediating sites eventually or cleaning them up will contest that link that people are seeing between environmental contamination and their own health outcomes. So in this contested illnesses research group, we look at that phenomenon nationwide and globally, right? Why does this happen? What power dynamics drive that? Why do we have this biomedical paradigm that we focus on instead of an environmental health paradigm? And that paradigm shift is happening, and it's really happening strongly at places like Brown's Medical School and many other prestigious places, right? But
I'm sorry, I got to slow you down here.
Yeah.
Could you unpack what you mean by biomedical paradigm shifting to environmental justice paradigm?
Yes, environmental health paradigm.
Okay,
so what I was saying before with biomedical focuses on your diet, your lifestyle, your genetics. It very much focuses on individual level behavior, right? That determines our health. So what's my genetic makeup, right? What decisions and choices do I make as an individual in terms of the diet that I'm eating and the lifestyle that I live? This is what we tend to focus on if we think about Western health, right? It's very focused on an internal individual locus of control, and it doesn't tend to look at those other impacts on health that are more structural and social and environmental. So that's what I was talking about when I was saying, like, we have social impacts on our health, right? We have certain people can't access healthcare. We have a lot of health disparities in the United States. And so even access to healthcare is limited and very uneven. And that is moving back in that direction in this country. So what we're looking at with the environmental health paradigm or model, and Phil Brown has really developed a lot of this work, as has the Contested Illnesses Research Group. The idea is that we need to really be paying attention to not just the individual locus of control or individual level of health, but also looking at those other aspects of health. So what is the community like? What are the public health situations that people are dealing with? What are these legacy sites that people might live within or around? And how does the environment impact their health? So having a more multi-layered view of disease and of health and wellness, and it's much more holistic. So an environmental health paradigm would encourage looking at all of those facets, but even the way we look at individual decisions or genetics, really taking that into consideration. So for example, epigenetics is a field that is rapidly developing and very exciting right now, that's looking at how our genetic code and how our genes are even read years after we're born are affected while we're in utero by potential toxins and contaminants and other healthy things, right, that we are exposed to while we're in utero. So that's an example of how even this thing that we conceive of as being incredibly individual and predetermined really isn't, and can be very impacted by dynamics and contaminants in the environments around us. Does that help explain what I'm talking
totally,
about?
Yeah.
Okay.
And epigenetics is fascinating.
Yes.
But I want to bring that all back down to earth. Can you put that in the context of Rocky Flats and this particular study?
Definitely. So the reason why, what we were talking about in the Contested Illnesses Research Group, right, in relation to Kristen Iverson's book and how this relates to the site, is that this is the core tension here, right? That you have community members that are experiencing rare diagnoses, community members that are perceiving a connection between exposure to Rocky Flats related contaminants, either historically or currently, that they're having, and they're connecting that with health experiences that they're having, typically being diagnosed with a rare disease or having a whole suite of ailments that they're dealing with that they connect to Rocky Flats and contamination from it, but which others in positions of power contest. Right? They say, no, you might be experiencing those things and being diagnosed, but we can't show that there's a causal link between the contamination related to Rocky Flats and your illness. right? So that defines the issue at Rocky Flats right now, this issue of contested illness. And agencies like some of our federal agencies that were responsible for the site when it was operating, but also state agencies in Colorado not being as responsive to community requests for community-driven health studies as people would like.
I think you're alluding to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment.
Yes.
Which they ran their own study of health effects back in the late 90s.
And they've done recent studies as well to follow up on some of these requests, but they use state data and they use cancer registry data, whereas people are requesting community-based data collection about their diagnoses.
Okay. So let's talk about this community survey that Carol Jensen from Metro State started and now you're working on. Now, it's my understanding that it sort of stemmed from the response from Kristen Iverson's book. Carol, I think, has said that, and Kristen Iverson has said, she got a lot of responses of people who reported these health effects. They suspected it was connected to the site, but like you said, it's really hard to prove. So then what happened next? And why did what happened next lead to this methodology?
Well, I think Carol can describe that a little bit better because she already had the idea for the survey in place by the time I was contacted and was trying to join. What I did was I tried to intervene in the survey instrument that they were using because they had a quite lengthy survey instrument. It was 25 pages long. We reduced it to one that the Utah Department of Health had used for their uranium communities and similar health issues that were emerging there. And we were able to have about a 6-page survey instrument. I want to emphasize, though, that we used, against my advice, we used a very convenient method of sampling. We didn't even use sampling. We just allowed people to respond to the survey. It was exploratory data collection, and we were just trying to get a sense of the initial perception of people in the community. We are still looking for funding to do a rigorous health study in the community. So I want to be clear that it's not going on now, that we had some basic descriptive statistics that we could gather from that survey, which we reported during community meetings at the end of 2016. And so that survey is stalled out right now because we do not have funding to continue a much more robust community-based health survey, which is what we'd like to do. We also are trying to access a sampling frame so that we can send the survey to a sample of folks from who are living in that area during a certain period of time. And we're trying specifically to get a list related to the class action lawsuit that was settled against Rockwell and it was that list of people will give us a sense of who is living there during a certain period of time where now we've shown that the court has decided, right, that their property values were affected by potential contamination from the site. So it was exploratory. That part is done, but we are now in need of, we want to go forward and be able to do what the community does, but it's exceptionally, what the community wants, I should say, but it's exceptionally expensive to do that. And so, not exceptionally expensive compared to some science, but it will cost tens of thousands of dollars. So we are looking at how we can crowdsource funding or work with CSU and other universities to get funding. So that's the status of that. What my team is doing right now is we're collecting oral histories from folks who reported rare cancers on that survey and are willing to participate in interviews or have contacted us subsequently because our community partners like Rocky Flats Downwinders and Rocky Flats Glows and Rocky Flats Right to Know, they are helping us reach out to community members who contact them, right, and report these rare health problems or health issues that they're connecting to contamination from the site. Does that explain the two different components? Okay.
Yeah, it's really clear. You said Rocky Flats Glows. Did you mean Candelas Glows?
They go back and forth in their names.
Do they?
Candelas Glows, I think, was the first name, and then Alicia said that they were switching over to Rocky Flats Glows, but maybe that isn't the case.
Okay.
I might be off.
I need to check with that.
Yes, it's Candelas Glows, and it's the same group, but I was just operating under the assumption that they were actually changing.
I'm particularly interested. I have that in a script right now for an episode that's coming out in a couple weeks, so I got to get that right soon. Yeah,
and I could be wrong. Maybe they decided not to change.
Okay.
There's a lot of Rocky Flats something then, right?
Yeah. Oh my God.
So maybe they want us to keep the more distinctive name.
In writing the histories of this place, every group is Rocky Flats something group, and that word is basically interchangeable. There's like 10 of those words. They all mean the same thing. And
yes.
All these groups are so different. Anyway.
They are, right. Yeah.
Okay, so the preliminary study, and you made very clear it's preliminary. I'll reiterate that it was preliminary, not a full survey.
Right, not descriptive. We can't have any high-level statistical or representative information from it, which is very important. But it could. The point of exploratory studies is they point you in the direction of where to take the next phase of research.
Yeah.
Yes.
To know how much money it would take to do a proper one. So you could write a proper grant.
To know what we're asking people, to know who would be the best, the most appropriate kind of time period and sample to draw from, all those sorts of things.
So what questions did you ask in that initial study, and like how did you distribute it? Who did you target?
So I wasn't in charge of the survey distribution. I want to say that Metro State and Carol Jensen were overseeing this. But my understanding is that against my better judgment, again, this was put online, and people that team openly advertised that you could take this study. It was advertised especially through Rocky Flats Downwinders and other groups that were working with that team at Metro State before I even became involved. The survey instrument itself, that I was integrally involved in because I was really advocating that it needed to be shorter so people would finish it, right? And so that instrument was a fairly concise set of questions about how long people had lived in the area, where they had lived, basic descriptive information about that kind of biographical history for each person, and then ask specific questions about different diseases or ailments that folks may have been diagnosed with. So importantly, it's all self-reported data, right? Yeah. But it allowed us to capture the range of self-reported health issues that were going on in the community. If that describes what it consisted of. We also I provided the team with some tablets, and they were able to visit some people at their homes to be able to take the study if they weren't able to access the internet or go out of their homes to take the study, because there are a lot of really sick folks. And who wanted to participate. So that was part of the issue in it being representative, right? We had very little control over who took the survey, how many times they took the survey, and there are some serious statistical issues with that. But if we're able to do that next phase in a more rigorous sampled survey, we would be able to build on the exploratory and descriptive data that we gathered from the first iteration, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay.
Is there a time limitation of like people you wanted to document, like up until the 89 raid, or was there any other limit?
Well, no, we're trying to figure that out, right? We're very much trying to say there are two different issues here, right? One is contamination and exposure while the facility was operating. Yeah. Past the raid even, right? Because there was Superfund cleanup and other cleanup going on for a while after that. But there's also these legacy issues, as with any highly contaminated site. Even the Superfund cleanup couldn't remediate. I mean, there are certain levels of remediation depending on how far below the surface you go, right? You know this. So once you get to 6 feet below the surface, it really hasn't been remediated. It's been contained and buried. But the concern is, right, separate from that initial phase of operation, what's going on now in this area where the site doesn't exist anymore. There's not even signage that the site was there. But you have the potential for the National Wildlife Refuge to have hiking trails through it, and especially the controversies around, of course, as you know, right, classes and schools taking their classes and their students to the site for field trips, and potential exposure through that set of pathways, right? Being on the site, the Jefferson Parkway, all of these other kinds of minor or major construction efforts that can go on, and then public interaction with the site, right? There's concern that that's not safe, and there's a lot of debate about whether it is. Some say it is, some say it isn't, right? Yeah. But the issue, too, in terms of what Candelas Glows was looking at and what's going on with new development, and I think this is actually the key issue, that there's also contestation over how much contamination is in these buffer areas that aren't on the site but are on the perimeter of what the site was, or have had, with work of Michael Ketterer and Harvey Nichols and some of these other folks that have been doing research for a long time. And even Carl Johnson's initial research said, there shouldn't be development within 10 miles of this site. And now you have these developments that are really creeping in on, they're not on the site, but they're on the perimeter. And there's concern that there may be contamination or may have been some contamination there that isn't necessarily being disclosed as transparently to potential home buyers as some advocates would like and are fighting for, particularly Rocky Flats GLOs or Candelas GLOs.
Right. So, for similar reasons, the government data on the presence of offsite contamination or suspect would be the same reasons that the CDPHE health study would be suspect. Just like it's good to have an independent study.
Yes, and I wouldn't say that CDPHE is suspect necessarily, right?
Okay.
It's that they're using data at the state level. They're using a database and a cancer registry and other state level data that they have about diagnoses. They're not going into communities and surveying a sample of people about their health experiences, right? So it's a very different kind of data that you're getting. So the results that they have or the findings that they have, some would argue, for example, right, that the cancer registry doesn't have really accurate data all the time because even if you acquire a cancer So, for example, one of the interviews I've done, a woman was diagnosed with a certain kind of cancer when she lived in Evergreen, but she had grown up and lived in and around Arvada for her entire life and had just been in Evergreen for a year, right? But in the cancer registry, that diagnosis happens there, and so it's recorded as a case of cancer that's there, right? So if we're looking at that level of data and we've got the numbers, most of the time, if all those cancers are accurately reported and different states have different, their registries have different levels of accuracy because it's based on that kind of reporting. But when you're trying to look at, do we have a certain number of cases of cancer that are a higher rate than we would expect that are coming from a certain location, that's just one example of a problem that emerges, right? So the difference is if the CDPHE would have epidemiologists or others go into communities and have this rigorous health study that's looking at what is happening on the ground, and that's what people are requesting, right? Then that would be different. And it would be much more expensive and much more time consuming, but that's what these folks are requesting, and that's what the CDPHE is repeatedly not doing. So that's one of the sources of tension. The other is that they've got thousands of pages of documents on their website, and they push people towards that and they say, go look at this, we have all this information. And this has been a key source of tension between what I'm trying to talk about in terms of environmental justice and what that agency keeps coming after me about, right? And it just has to do with the fact that you can have thousands of pages of information, but it's almost an embarrassment of riches, right? It's so voluminous that you, as a citizen, right, as a layperson, even as an expert, you wouldn't have the time or the expertise to navigate all of it. I have a graduate student that's doing their entire thesis on going through just a portion of those documents to make sense of them. He has background in this, and he can't even navigate what most of it's talking about. So that's the key issue here, is that you can have an abundance of data, but if it's not, and it can be accessible, right? You can click on it online and you can look at it. But if it's not data that is translated for use by the public, or if it's not data that doesn't require a degree in toxicology or chemistry to even start to understand what all these things mean, then I question how useful that is, especially given the fact that many of these people are like you and me. They have full-time jobs, they work, they have kids, they have grandkids. Many of them have health problems that they're going to get treated in their quote-unquote spare time. So pretending that these folks are able to really use that information because it's sitting there, that I find that to be, it just doesn't reflect what people are telling me they're actually experiencing. And it's a consistent problem across these contaminated communities. It's not just this case.
You're speaking my language right now. The overabundance of data,
yes,
and the lack of like a middle ground or any explanation for people has been a source of enormous frustration for me in the past year.
Yes, I know why.
So hard.
Yes.
Okay, let me go back. The data thing, it's really interesting. I understand what you're saying about the cancer registry and how that data is flawed for relating to this specific issue because people move around a lot. That all makes sense. Mm-hmm. But, okay, so how do I ask this? This is a complicated question. The problem is the dispute that you've been talking about is the CDPHE's study and the cancer registry doesn't show any disproportionately large numbers of cancers downwind, right? So they say that that's evidence that there was no major offsite contamination, and that reinforces their position that it's safe for hiking trails, the parkway to be built, stuff like that. So with this study and this survey and getting more detailed information about the downwind communities and here's the question, is it trying to demonstrate that there is a cancer cluster?
We don't have an agenda going into it, right?
Well, some people do.
Well, my perception on this, my approach to this study, though, has been that I am trying to answer that I'm a community-driven sociologist, right? That my methods are community-based participatory research, typically. And what that means is I'm working with a community with my set of expertise to try to help answer the questions that they're interested in and that they don't feel like they're getting from other parties, right? So I don't have an agenda going into this, like this is happening and we're going to prove it. Right? That's not how the scientific method works. Instead, we are being approached by community members and we are trying to figure out the best methods, right, to attempt to answer the questions that they have. And the questions that they have are, why are my neighbors or myself being diagnosed with rare cancers or rare disorders that are like 1 in a billion, some of these, right? And why would my husband, for example, and not my husband, I'm talking, but why would my husband and then a child down the street have the same rare cancer, right? So these are things that are minute in the numbers, right? So first of all, what we're trying to do in capturing and collecting oral histories of folks who've been diagnosed with rare cancers or rare diseases is delve into that a little bit, because these are things that will not show up statistically, but are incredibly important to the experiences that people are having in these communities, and they're saying are not being captured and are not being accurately reflected in the health studies that are being done that are kind of at 30,000 feet, right? The other thing is that a lot of, and this relates back to what I was talking about before with contested illness, there is a great deal of debate over cause and effect, right? Epidemiology, one of their biggest goals, right, is to try to come up with the best ways to determine cause and effect. And sociologists are very concerned about that as well, but there are so many limitations to accurately doing that. When you're talking about health impacts and you're talking about exposure to things like uranium or plutonium contamination, where the health outcomes have these latency periods that can be 20 or 30 years, the issue is that we don't have the kind of environmental epidemiology developed to really capture that and to legitimate or help explain that kind of gap between exposure and onset, right? So there are a lot of complicated, unanswered dynamics in terms of how we do health research, and especially how we do research related to things like contested illness, contaminated sites, and human health beyond the Rocky Flats site, right, that are consistently problematic. And this isn't just unique to CDPHE and these groups having this tension. If you look at the history of uranium communities and the federal government and their stance on things, I mean, RECA, the Radioactive Exposure Compensation Act, is a Radiation Exposure Compensation Act is one of the few ways that our federal government has responded to the legacy of uranium development and nuclear testing in Nevada and all of those sorts of things, right? And they still push back on people saying there were health problems and you have to do all this documentation. So that's what we're responding to in this situation, that there's this gap between what people are experiencing and these studies that keep coming out. They're requesting something else, right? And it has to do with capturing these health experiences that our current modes of data collection, data analysis aren't necessarily equipped to do, right? It's different. Something like a case control study might be a better way to do this, right? So to look at Arvada and its rates of cancer and its rates of maybe even rates of rare cancers, if that can be captured, getting that kind of data collection that's more rigorous, and then comparing it to a comparable community with with many comparable demographic and geographical characteristics, but they didn't have the Rocky Flats site there, right? But that stuff's not being done. So I'm of the mind that if you keep using the same techniques and tools to answer the same to answer these questions, then you're going to end up with the same results. If there isn't a threat, right? If we just want to have a scientific approach and test these questions that community members have, then why wouldn't we do that? Is my question and my kind of driving motivation here. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I fully support this. As a journalist, I want more information.
Mm-hmm.
So I love this. I love that it's happening.
So I think it could complement CDPHE, right? It doesn't have to be this, I don't want it to be this antagonistic or conflict-ridden sort of thing, right? Our data could really, if we were able to fund it and collect this data, it could complement what they're able to do, since the CDPHE has 100 other things they're also trying to focus on, right? They're not just focused on Rocky Flats. They've got all these other issues and all these other parts of their agency, right? And so their budget is limited. I understand the limitations to doing this. I just don't understand why there has to be conflict and why our study is being attacked repeatedly by that agency.
Well, I have a suspicion about why, but I think
so do I. I have many suspicions, but I'll keep this to myself.
Okay, so $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 maybe would be how much it would take?
It would depend on how much we were charged for the sampling frame from the There are many ifs and question marks, so I wouldn't want to put a dollar amount on it, but that would be I would say $30,000 would be a very fair assessment if we weren't charged an arm and a leg to get access to those addresses. That's the biggest sticking point right now, aside from the funding.
Okay. I've heard from several activists, there's this common allegation that like the DOE is funding these regulatory bodies. Like Carl Sprang's office is funded by the DOE. He's paid by the DOE, so we can't take him seriously. And that, I mean, I don't know how much weight I put on that, but the argument is persuasive for some people. So I want to put the same thing to you when we're talking about this $30,000 and the question of like an agenda and proving a cancer cluster. So would you have any restrictions or qualifications on who you would accept money from?
Well, it wouldn't be, let me be clear too, when you're doing academic studies, typically you apply for grants through federal agencies like the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences or another federal agency, maybe more broadly, the NIH, which would fund health-related studies like this, right? And that would be, I have just completed an NIH-funded study on the impacts of living near oil and gas to quality of life and stress, for example. And that is about the best source of funding you can get because it's incredibly hands-off. It's a federal agency. And it doesn't have a stake in your research coming out a certain way. I very much hesitate to take any sort of funding or support from an industry group, developers, or environmental groups, because any of those, and they're very different, right? But any of those could be seen as funding sources that could perhaps create a conflict of interest or something like that. So for this study, for example, I've had a little bit of funding from the American Sociological Association. They have a grant called the SPVAC Community Action Research Initiative Grant. And it's very small. It's only a few $1,000s, but it really allowed me to provide the study with some tablets to go have people take surveys, to provide some time and expertise in terms of the survey, and then to hire some graduate students and be able to cover my transportation to get to and from taking these oral histories. So any little bit helps, but you just want to be federal agencies can provide some of the best funding with the least strings attached, depending upon their history with the site. And so that's why when you get into the Department of Energy, that funding source could be seen as a little compromised because of their relationship with the site. I am unaware, though, and I don't even want to say of any direct funding between the DOE and CDPHE.
So crowdfunding, would you feel like there's a conflict of interest?
No, that was the other thing I was going to mention. I think that is actually one of the most promising modes of funding a study like this, if you're not going to go that grant route, right, and get grants from foundations. Foundations are excellent too, right, because they'll often have no strings attached, no political interest. So foundations, federal agencies, and then that kind of grant writing that I was mentioning before. The other side of this that is really in development is crowdfunding. And I've been trying to do that with this study, and it's a very slow start because CSU is still learning how to do that and set up mechanisms for it. But what's really appealing to about that to me is that you can have thousands of people that might chip in $5 or $10, and you end up with enough financial resources to do this study that really has no strings attached because you don't have a major funder or a major donor or something like that, right? You've got instead a community of people that in their own small way, each individual has supported the study. And so in my mind, that gives you the most freedom to ask these scientific questions and not have any sort of, I have never experienced a funding agency pushing back on anything I've done. I want to say that others have, but I have not. But to avoid that, right, crowdfunding is an excellent way to have a little bit more freedom in terms of how you're collecting your data and how you're interpreting it, especially.
And I think that's a perfectly good place to end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Stephanie
you.
Malin, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Changing Denver is a proud member of the Denver Podcast Network. In the shadow of the mountains,
we speak.
Unclear Danger, the Colorado story of Rocky Flats, is being produced in partnership with the Colorado Independent and the Denver Public Library. Support the show with a pledge on Patreon, www.patreon.com/changingdenver. Follow us at Changing Denver on Twitter, and let others know what you think with a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks to Stephanie Malin and Randy Stafford for talking to me for this episode. Thanks also to Susan Green and Tina Griego at the Colorado Independent, Jenny LaPerriere at the Denver Public Library, and Megan Ariano. Our theme song is Minnow by Felix Fast Forward. The other music you heard in this episode is by Lee Rosevere and Ethernaut. Unclear Danger concludes very soon. But until then, I'm your host, Paul Caroli.